one of the things that they emphasized in these texts was that the Rosicrucian organization wasn't connected to any one authoritative teacher, and it wasn't connected to any particular type of control structure. There was no institution for it. It was really a very free and independent path of modern initiation. And so one thing we're going to see tonight as we go through the presentation is that this fits within their understanding of the evolution of human consciousness, that we have attained a state today where there is actually a transition from an external human guru-based system to one in which the awakening of the human I am presence becomes the guru and connects directly to spiritual forces without a human intermediary. That was a fundamental concept in the early Rosicrucian text. So the Rosicrucian order really became something that never had an external expression until later. In times people would found different types of Rosicrucian lodges. Many of them were quite remarkable in their time. In Germany and elsewhere, there are various types of Rosicrucian organizations in the US today. But what I want to emphasize is that what we're presenting tonight are concepts related to the original European Rosicrucian impulse. It's not related to any particular central teacher, organization. We're not trying to recruit you for anything. This is really a path of direct connection to spirit by understanding spiritual processes. So it all begins understanding the whole set of processes by understanding where everything comes from. In the ancient Greek times, they talked about the source of all being with the name of the One, in capital letters, the One. And this is a beautiful representation within sacred geometry that everything comes from a unified source. So within human evolution, we've gone through a certain pathway that we'll talk about in a moment, where in sacred geometry and the ancient Egyptian mysteries, they talked about the one becomes the two becomes the four becomes the eight. It ends up becoming the 10,000 things the Chinese talk about. But everything comes from the unified source of the One. It's all creation from the mind of God. And in the classical Western work from Greece and elsewhere, they talk about thoughts in the mind of God being the source of everything. And that's what Plato referred to as ideal types, or ideal thought forms. These are actually what construct the world. These thoughts in the mind of God take on different separate qualities and different separate functions in the world, and then they manifest through the different planes. It's understood from the classical Western Hermetic as above, so below tradition, of which Rosicrucianism is one of the most recent expressions, that the nature of the mind of God is essentially pure consciousness. Everything is based on a field of pure consciousness. You find the exact same teaching in the ancient Vedic text and many other world traditions. Consciousness is the basis. So starting from these differentiated thought forms in the mind of God at a very high level, those thought forms have within them specific patterns. The pattern of what will later become something that crystallizes into the physical world, or the nature of a spiritual being, or a spiritual process of some type. And again, that's what we refer to as sacred geometry. So to actually begin to access these packed thought forms, these very dense spiritual sources of everything in creation, again, every major tradition will teach it in terms of pure patterns, in terms of pure sacred geometry. So from that thought form pattern, sacred geometry level, it then moves down through the levels of manifestation to create everything in our world. And the first thing that it creates are the manifested beings. Now, the manifested conscious spiritual beings that surround us in invisible space all the time and that make up the world at a much higher level, in the Western tradition, we primarily know through terms like the angelic ranks or the spiritual hierarchies. In the classical Western tradition, there is understood to be 9 different ranks of angelic beings. So we often, in general metaphysical circles or in external churches today, hear about a few of them. We hear about the angels and the archangels, occasionally in archai. The Elohim is sometimes talked about, but not often clearly in its original form as the Elohim being one of the different spiritual ranks or hierarchies. Because the term Elohim in the original Hebrew has a suffix im, Elohim. And im in Hebrew is actually a plural suffix. It means the Elohim are a group of spiritual beings. When we have the translation from Hebrew into English of the book of Genesis, back in 1980 I lived in Israel and studied Hebrew at a kibbutz. One of the things that was discussed is that when you get these translations from the text, the term Elohim is translated in English as God, and it seems to refer to the unitary Godhead. But the original term Elohim refers to a plurality of beings that are not the unified Godhead, but in the beginning, Elohim created the heavens and the earth, is the beginning of Genesis. And so what that shows is there's a rank of spiritual beings that were directly indicated that did the creation process. And so from the Elohim, you then have other hierarchies we hear very little about, because their state of consciousness is very elevated, but they're known in the classical text. And these are the dynamis, kyriatetes, throne, cherubim, and seraphim, 9 different ranks. And it's understood that these beings were created in a particular type of cyclical process in space and time that in sacred geometry is represented as a spiral form. So if you look at the form of a spiral, you have the completion of a circle, but as the circle is moving, it's moving either up or down. And so as the spiral is moving, it's completing a circle here, but now it's at one higher octave, and another end of the cycle on a higher octave. And so this becomes the ladder, the Jacob's ladder, the ladder of lights, the ladder of the angelic beings, spoken of in the classical text. The significance of this for us is that these different beings are of different levels of maturity, have different levels of the expansion of their consciousness, and different possibilities for action. So what is sometimes treated in very intellectual, abstract ways in dealing with angelic hierarchies was understood in the initiation circles as beings one directly interacts with all the time. They invisibly guide and affect our consciousness and life every minute of every day, but we don't perceive it, just as we don't normally have organs to perceive non-physical realities until they're developed. So again, what the significance of this is that as the Godhead has created the world, the thought forms at a very high level are given a part of the consciousness of the Godhead that in classical texts is sometimes described as an ocean of fire. So if we think of the pure consciousness of the Godhead as an ocean of fire, then there is one flame, one spark detached from that ocean of consciousness and given to the conscious spiritual beings that make up what in the West we refer to as the angelic ranks or the spiritual hierarchies. Now this is very important because it's that spark from the Godhead that is essential to understand the Rosicrucian path of initiation, because it's about igniting that spark inside the human being. Every human being has that divine core, what in the Western system is often referred to as the I am core of self-awareness, straight from the Godhead. The thing is to uncover it and to fan the flame into full activity. So as the thoughts from the mind of God move down and we have the manifested beings, in classical texts they describe the spiritual hierarchies, they describe the angelic beings in very specific ways. Their names actually mean particular things. So if you look at the names of the archangels, Raphael means God heals. And other names like Michael mean such things as various powers within God that in the Rosicrucian tradition are expressed as such thing as Michael being the direct expression of the cosmic intelligence, that the fullness of understanding that the Godhead has is actually expressed through the being of Archangel Michael. So different beings, their names actually mean something. Different teachers in esoteric circles will sometimes break this down, even according to their old Egyptian languaging. So for something like Urael, it would be broken down into the U-Ra-El, meaning literally the sun vibration god. They're all different qualities of the Godhead. And that's why in the classical text, the angels are sometimes referred to as God's messengers. And it was understood that we had to actually be clear about what beings were interacting with us. Because if we just say, oh, I spoke to God or God told me this, it's too amorphous. We don't know what beings are actually speaking to us. And not all the beings are beneficial. Again, something that comes from the classical text. We'll get to that in a moment. But as we then have the manifestation from the mind of God through the angelic ranks, we then come to the point that we then have the different manifested spiritual levels. So these different consciousness levels also will then manifest as what we think of as spiritual planes. In the East, they have all kinds of different names for the different planes of existence. And in the West, we have the terms you may have heard before with the physical plane, the etheric world, the astral plane, the causal plane, etc. And there are different ways this is divided in different systems. But essentially, these different planes of existence are actually part of the body of God, but they're the body of God at a particular level of function or activity. the astral plane, for example, is really the manifested body of God at a consciousness level.